Everyone, welcome to this event and a very warm welcome to also people who are joining us online, as well as here in the council room. I really love this room. I've done quite a few events now. It's very nice and full of heritage, and when we toast in the next room, you'll also see that one's quite nice as well. Welcome to this pre-conference event of the International Behavioural Public Policy Conference, where the 4th edition, which starts here at King's from the 10th, which is on Wednesday. So many of you will be there, but also people joining us just for this event. We appreciate that you've come here, especially given for everybody who's made the journey thanks to the industrial action and the strikes and all the chaos that we see outside. So we appreciate your commitment to being here. To what I'm sure will be a very thought-provoking discussion on Yuval's book. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce this panel and also especially the book by Professor Yuval Feldman. I've had a chance to read the book and I've been really fascinated, Yuval, so I'm looking forward to the discussion here. This event is brought to you by the School for Government and the Policy Institute here at King's College London. And we're delighted to have all of you here as part of this. Now, before we begin, some ground rules. I hope your phones are on silent. I checked that myself, actually, because I'm very bad with this. The toilets are just down the corridor if you head out towards your right. We don't have any planned fire alarms, so if you hear one, then we have to evacuate. So I can start with the introduction of the panel. So first of all, we have Professor Yuval Feldman, who's the Mori Lazaroff Professor of Legal Research at Bar-Ilan University. Professor Feldman is a renowned law and psychology scholar whose work sits at the intersection of behavioral science and legal policy. His forthcoming book, Can the Public Be Trusted? The Promise and Perils of Voluntary Compliance, will form the centerpiece of tonight's discussion and launch. Joining us in the panel discussion, we also have Elizabeth Costa, Chief of Innovation and Partnerships at the Behavioral Insights team. Liz brings invaluable practical experience in applying behavioral insights to real-world policy challenges across the government, and in particular, she has a book which is currently being written with David, coming out next year, hopefully with...
David does have a surname.
Yes, Michael keeps telling me to call people with surname. David Halpin, coming out next year with HarperCollins in the US. So I'm going to reference the book and the work in tonight's discussion so you can also get an insight into what's coming out next year. We're also delighted to have Professor Michael Sanders, who's the Director of the School for Government at the Policy Institute here at King's College London. Michael's expertise in translating academic research into practical governance solutions will provide crucial perspective into how these ideas might work. And also in particular, Michael has a book coming out next year on bad practice. I'm going to give you the full title when we speak, and I'm going to reference that. It's out with OUP, Oxford University Press. So just a quick word on the format. We'll start by hearing first from Professor Yuval Feldman.
You haven't mentioned that you have a book coming out.
Yes. I also have a book coming out. That's important. We all have books coming out. I'll also reference my own book when we speak. It's coming out with Palgrave Macmillan, just in the true spirit of mentioning everybody. We'll start by hearing from Yuval, who will present his insights on the central question of whether the public can be trusted. Following his presentation, Liz and Michael will then share their thoughts and reflections on the book and its implications. Then we'll open it up for what I hope will be a very lively discussion with all of you. And I have some spare questions in case you're very shy to ask some, which I hope you'll not be. And for those of you joining us in person, please do stay afterwards as well. We'll have drinks and networking opportunities in the old committee room, which is just behind us, through the adjoining door. Now, without further delay, let me hand it over to Yuval to launch the book and explore this question of how the public can be trusted and what this means for governance. Yuval, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sanchayan and Elizabeth and Michael, for joining the panel and for Harmony for administrating. It's really a pleasure to be here. A lot of the behavioral public policy kind of movement started in London, so
to speak about the book here is is a really honor. I have like 15 minutes, so obviously can really give a very rough overview of some of the topics the book discussed, and I'm really looking forward more to hear your thoughts about it. It's, in a sense, I have to say, it's kind of part of a research group funded by the ERC that tries to understand kind of voluntary compliance, kind of the main research question being to what extent can state cause people not just to comply but want to comply, whether it's actually a good idea and how we can get there, and kind of the general framework of the whole book is try to connect first to the kind of all the relevant literature related to social norms, compliance, behavioral public policy, all of them coming up with this idea of how to create people who are more honest, who are more compliant, more cooperative. Those different concepts, different predictions, and the ability to connect them is part of what kind of the the first chapters of the book focus on. The second kind of main point is this notion of extrinsic, intrinsic. So we have the increasing the behavioral public policy is famous for this whole regulatory toolbox where it used to be only command and control. Now we have so many other interventions we could actually use, moving from more extrinsic one coercive towards more intrinsic and cooperative, and then in a sense brings the question of voluntary compliance a more nuanced flavor, and then this idea of a context. So even if we try to understand whether voluntary compliance and trusting the public is good, obviously it's going to depend on the context. So I'm focusing in the book on mostly on environment, tax, and public health. Depends on the population and depends on culture, which obviously a very big question, and a lot of the things we do in the lab is doing comparative studies on the likelihood that voluntary compliance will work, and so this is kind of the general framework. The kind of holy grail for the whole project is understanding what's effective voluntary compliance. So in a sense, something which is related to things like beyond compliance, which is a known concept, so people doing more than they need to, a higher quality of compliance, positive externalities to society, so it's not just a given situation, but what happens, more likely to work for a longer time, resilient to all kind of exogenic shocks, increased willingness to pay. So this is all the good things associated with voluntary compliance, and obviously the big question is that something which we can actually achieve somehow, and to what extent and when? There are many limited findings associated with understanding causality. Heterogeneity in population is one of the major obstacles of even getting voluntary compliance. I'll talk about it more in the next slides. We have a lot of competing scales, and I mentioned that before. Some mixed findings, also going to mention whether it's actually going to work and for how long. Some of the problems I talk about is the small effect sizes. So, for example, intrinsic motivation. I think I have it in some of the slides, something like tax morale, which is a lot of efforts where tax authorities try to convince the public that it's actually very good to pay taxes. In meta-analysis we did, first we found a very small effect, now it's actually non-significant. So this whole idea of tax morale, so many people talk about it, at the end of the day, not going to have any effect. So then one have to answer, should we actually invest so much in convincing the public that it's really the moral thing to do is to pay taxes? The fact that the effects in most studies are very short term, what I actually learn from them, cross-domain predictability, this is something we focus a lot both experimentally and also normatively. So I'm also a legal scholar. This is something very problematic to say, okay, if someone is a very good, or sorry, very bad driver, what can we actually know about or can take into account when we try to evaluate the taxes? So is there any connection? Are we allowed to take that into account? We have some assumption that past behavior is legitimate only within a doctrinal domain. The question is, If we know it's actually going to improve predictability and help authorities, should we do it? We know it's kind of raised a lot of concerns related to privacy and so on, but it's something at least to think about. Some of the kind of focuses of the book is if we had to trust everyone, we'll end up trusting no one. So we have to have some differentiation, and it's a very complicated thing to do. And then we have a lot of normative challenges related to the perils of internalization, for example. So if we want the public to want to comply, it might mean that the government will engage in all kind of manipulative action. Do we want it? Maybe it's actually best if people hate to pay taxes, they do it, but they hate you at the same time. Maybe it's safer to kind of make sure the public is actually very critical and actually not too trustworthy. And this is kind of the example of vaccination, I think, is an important one. So just kind of the idea that we don't always need high quality of compliance. So think of, from COVID era, the difference between mask wearing and vaccination, where at least, again, obviously it's a bit of a caricature, but in vaccination, in a sense, someone can be very unhappy. Coming to the clinic, giving you a shoulder, you give them the vaccine, they don't like it, but it's as effective whether they believe in it or not. But if you take mask wearing, it's so hard to monitor. Someone can actually put it a bit below the nose, and then it's ineffective. So you need to have true believers for it to actually be effective. And this is just an example to think about how much should we invest in trying to get kind of voluntary compliance. And I'll give some more examples. And this is just to show, and I have a whole chapter trying to understand what voluntary compliance even mean, and it can mean so many different things, kind of mostly relying on the book and two definition of intrinsic motivation and non-coerced, which is on kind of the negative side of what's voluntary compliance. And there are all kind of regulatory approaches associated with each definition, again, just to show how complex is this whole literature, and this was part of the challenge, is trying to connect those literature into something which is a bit more coherent. Even in my own work, I'm just kind of discussing in the book a lot of work I did, like for example with Tom Tyler, where we show that mandating procedural justice actually make it stronger. In some other papers, we actually show that voluntary reporting is stronger than mandatory one. We have a paper on the nation law showing some people actually moving against the effect of the law, so the people become less likely to behave as the law wants because of psychological reactance. We have, so this is, I talked with Michael Lifitz, so this is work with Mariam Kochaki and Francesca Gino. There was some, it's actually a very relevant, it was tested, the data is real. I don't know if you know why I'm saying it, but it's actually suggesting in a sense that if you view your employer as being more kind of nice, you're more likely to cheat him. So this in a sense suggests that the whole idea of voluntary is very limited, because if you very much focus on the goodwill of people, they might exploit it, at least some people, some other work. So actually I'm gonna, I have my timer, I say I only have 6 minutes, so but again, a lot of inconsistency in my own work and many others' work about whether indeed allowing the public to get into the compliance not through sanctions and mandates, but through some other regulatory means, is it actually going to be better or worse? I think I'm actually going to skip to, I think the promise is kind of relatively straightforward. I mentioned all of it, there is a lot of good things associated with it. I want to actually go to the, to the Perils one. So the heterogeneity, in a sense that usually we kind of tend to think that voluntary compliance is better because it's, for example, reduce the administrative burden from good people who would have complied anyway. But some of the things we show that it's actually going to increase the gap between good people and bad people, because the fact that we're going to reduce enforcement at the end of the day will be more beneficial for bad people than for good people, and then in a sense we might end up being in a situation, also combining it with kind of, Fischbacher is one example of the whole conditional voluntary idea. So people will, conditional compliance idea where people will obey so long as others obey. So if we might see some shift where more people will start not to obey, we might even if we start the whole exercise with 60, 70% of compliance, it's actually might move to the worst. And the problem of the manipulative actions I mentioned before. So for governments to have people who want to comply, they need to make more effort when we compare it to situations we only need to affect their behavior. We have a lot of studies, and this is really the classic social psychology, that it's not even clear that the fact that someone believes that something should be done, so the kind of, the Good Samaritan experiments of Batson and Darley from 40, 50 years ago, people could believe, good things should happen, but at the end of the day, they don't do it. So if we invest so much effort in trying to convince people, to give them reasoning, make them believe in the purpose of the law, we don't have enough evidence to suggest that it's actually going to work. Again, a lot of democratic problems with even the attempts of government to change what people believe rather than what people do. Yeah, so I mentioned the mega-analysis. I think I'm going to skip those works. And just some examples, for example, where I have in the book comparing environment versus tax versus health. So for example, if you think about proportion of compliers, in tax, for example, usually the argument is the more the merrier. So the fact that some people evade taxes in itself will not make the law ineffective. However, for example, in COVID context, there was this feeling that if you don't get into 60, 70% of the people getting the vaccine, the whole endeavor is less effective. If you think, for example, my PhD dissertation was on kind of the divergence of trade secrets in Silicon Valley. And then in trade secrets, it's enough for few people not to comply for the trade secrets to completely lose its economic value. So this is an example for a doctrine where we need more people to comply for it to work. Then maybe voluntary is not a good approach. We also need to think about, is it the behavior we try to change, is it something which is daily, like we have in environmental context, or is it something that happens once a year, twice a year, like taxation? Some of the doctrines have more kind of the issue of trust in science. You don't have it so much in tax, for example. You have it in environment. You have it in COVID. The polarization, which in some countries is really on the rise, also undermines the likelihood that voluntary compliance might work. I have a recent publication with Tyler and one of my postdocs, Libby Maman. We're actually showing how polarization undermines the efficacy of trust-based regulation, and also something to take into account. Again, in many ways, I think the book tries to advocate for voluntary compliance, but end up being very critical about the likelihood that it's actually going to work, and at least want us to be very cautious if we want to push forward. What are the things we should worry about? We have a lot of problems that, again, there are many. I have like a whole chapter on crowding out, which is very widely used. Okay, if you use incentive, it crowds out intrinsic motivation. If you actually look at the studies, it's not as big of an effect and consistent effect as people actually tend to think. It's not always the case that once you introduce sanctions, for example, it might undermine the functioning of intrinsic motivation. Sometimes it could even enhance it. I talked to Liz before, for example, that again, this is, we don't have the full results yet, but we have this feeling that if a regulator focuses a lot of kind of sanctions, it's kind of very not flexible. We don't like him. It's kind of, a lot of the paradigms are against him, but sometimes even kind of the nudging regulator, who actually usually relying on new behavioral intervention, might seem as someone who is not really believing in the in really trying to care about compliance. And we use the example of the soda tax. The potential for machine learning. So that's the 15 minutes. So let me just, okay, maybe I will just go to the last slide. So again, intrinsic motivation, very important. again, something I didn't talk about a lot is the whole the difference between enhancement and ensuring. So for regulators to rely on voluntary compliance, it's not enough to show that things like, Tom Tyler shows that procedural justice enhanced by 5-7%. The tax compliance, we need to ensure compliance. This is a huge challenge for if you expect regulators to kind of give up on their traditional command and control. The combination of heterogeneity and crowding out is a very problematic challenge. We don't have enough data on long-term benefits. We try to collect some data. Again, very hard to do those studies. There is a lot of constitutional problems associated with voluntary compliance. Past behavior could be a very problematic. So we talk a lot about algorithms helping us to know who to trust. Again, could be seen as a slippery slope related to groups and some problems associated with some of the ideas that should be as not evaluate regulatory intervention as solely, but also in tandems. Yeah, I think I should stop here. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, the screen's gone black now. Good. Thanks, Yuval. I guess the title of your book is much rhetorical. I did have this sense after reading the book. I think in some sense you're trying to deduce the argument, no, the public cannot be trusted for most of the cases. Well, actually, given how rhetorical it is. But maybe building off my first question for Liz, and of course feel free to structure your comments otherwise. I'll draw directly to the book that you're working on, which sort of looks at quite a broad suite of tools in behavioral science, mostly also at empowering agents and sort of building an autonomous sort of citizenry. There's boosting, there's nudge plus. I have to pitch that in, given how much I work on it. But do you think that there are trade-offs then of using some of these approaches with the other standard kind of stick-based approaches? Or is it sufficient to build trust and sort of go down the pathway of voluntary compliance, which after reading your book has made me quite critical of the whole idea, Yuval? So yeah, reflections, Liz.
Great. Well, firstly, congratulations to you, Yuval. I have a newfound appreciation for anybody who writes a book, and I really enjoyed reading this one, so congratulations on publishing it. I might use this one instead. So yes, as Sanchian said, I've been thinking a lot about a suite of behavioural interventions that can help people build skills and competencies to be better decision makers in lots of different aspects of their lives. And I think it's really interesting that on the chart you put up, you put nudges on the boundary of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and the boundary of coercion and cooperation. And I think that is probably right, but I think it's also appropriate that I think those nudges in particular can and should do both of those things. So if you think about examples like defaults for pensions, I think we don't necessarily need to rely on building people's intrinsic motivation in those scenarios. We have a default that we think is broadly the right decision for the vast majority of people. It's not a decision that we need people to particularly engage with at most parts of their life until they reach retirement. And it broadly creates a pretty good outcome for most people. So I think in that case, yes, you do want to draw on something like a nudge that taps into extrinsic rather than intrinsic motivation. But I think there's also lots of scenarios where you want to go beyond that, and you do want tools that build reflection, skills and competencies that then I think would lead to people voluntarily complying with different types of regulations. And so, we've done a lot of work over the years on, what is the boundary between those two things, and how do you move beyond changing people's decision in a moment through changing the choice architecture to really trying to build those skills so that people can decide and have agency in lots of different decisions in their lives. I think I'm happy to talk more about that. I think another thing that came to mind when reading the book and listening to the presentation, you're very focused on trust in individuals and whether the public can be trusted. But I think all of the principles and the literature you draw on also has really interesting implications for whether regulators can trust companies and whether the public can trust companies and in what scenarios they can and can't. And I think it would be great to discuss that as well and to hear your reflections on, how could we regulate in a way that helps members of the public to have better signals as to when and how they should trust companies. I'm particularly thinking about our market regulators here in the UK and elsewhere. Might stop there and we can dig into any of those points.
Thanks so much for the reflections. I'd like to investigate a bit more there, but maybe jumping on to Michael and picking up on your last point on trust. Yuval and I were attending both, I think earlier this year at Cambridge when OECD brought out their trust survey. They did this large scale across 17 countries. And what was funny, and if I remember correctly, was UK was one of the lowest in terms of the trust indicators. Mm-hmm. So thinking about sort of can the public be trusted, I think it's a two-way road where you also need to build trust. And so my question to Michael, and given you also referenced Gino, there have been episodes in the past where behavioral scientists and psychologists have engaged in malpractices which have reduced trust. What could be the repercussions of that on something such as voluntary compliance?
That's a good question. I think in many ways it's pretty limited, if that's an okay answer.
Yeah.
So I'll try and run with that as an answer then. So most people don't know we exist. Most people possibly... who in this room knows who Francesca Gino is? Right, so of the self-selecting audience of people who come out to a behavioural science talk on a Monday evening during a tube strike, perhaps 20% of you know who Francesca Gino is, which bodes incredibly well for the sales of my book.
Go for it.
But never mind. Them's the breaks. So Francesca Gino, I won't belabor this, she was until very recently a professor at Harvard Business School. In 2021, Harvard Business School paid her $1 million for being a Harvard Business School professor, which is, in the technical parlance, a fuck ton of money. And I want to be very clear that King's does not pay anywhere near that much. We are talking orders of magnitude difference. I have to rent my bow ties. I can't even afford to. Actually, this one was a gift from somebody in the audience, so I shouldn't have said that. So she was fired, and it's the first person Harvard's ever fired who got tenure because of the fact there's convincing evidence, I would say compelling evidence, that she fabricated data in at least 4 of her papers, but not in verses very important, including the paper she has with Yuval, which is, he has a T-shirt that says, "I have not committed data fraud," which is, it's a great T-shirt to have, but you really don't want to be given it, you know? So,
go on.
That's okay. So, she's committed fraud, and there are good reasons why we should question the work of a lot of behavioral scientists. Again, nobody here. But because of the fact that, and fraud is only a very, very small part of this. A lot of the methodologies that were being deployed in the best period for behavioral science, so basically immediately after Predictably Irrational came out until about 2016 when this whole thing started falling down, there was a lot of questionable methodology. So there are good reasons why you might want to be, if you're interested in this kind of thing, skeptical of findings coming out of behavioral science. The caveat to that is that you should be most skeptical of findings coming out of behavioral science academics, because our incentive structure does not actually lend itself to truth-telling, despite the fact that's kind of what we're here for. Right? If you look at my promotion document, which I go through with people I line manage, it says you have to publish, 15 papers to get promoted?
Yeah.
It doesn't say if any of them have to be true. That's not a requirement. Ideally, we would prefer it, but it's not actually a requirement. Whereas people in the behavioral public policy world, so people who are in government doing behavioral science, people like Liz at the Behavioral Insights team, who are very much adjacent to government whilst not in it, actually matters to them, both for their professional careers and also from their own morality, whether or not this thing makes a difference to outcomes that we actually care about. Right? So if we go to the tax letter example, so telling people that 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, it really matters if that actually makes a difference to the Treasury, because firstly, it's really important that we collect as much tax as possible, and secondly, if you fake that, they'll know, because HMRC is very good at adding numbers up, and if you tell them they've got more money than they actually have, they won't believe you, as the Deputy Prime Minister learned to her peril last week. So I would say we should treat behavioural science findings coming out of academia, particularly between 2006 and 2016, with some caution. But there is very good reason to have a lot of faith and trust in the people who've been doing behavioural policy for real, as opposed to just being paid to talk about it. So that, I think, is that's where I would come from. In the more general sense of can the public be trusted, I think almost everybody, almost all the time, can be trusted. Most people are pretty decent most of the time. And that's, my PhD was on altruism, and I worked with the social action team in Cabinet Office when that was at the forefront. If anyone can remember the big society, no, just us. The overwhelming finding from everything is most people are pretty decent most of the time, and some people are dicks some of the time, and almost everybody is a dick occasionally. It's not a very scientific way of presenting that, but that is basically true. But there are times we can't trust the public, and I think the reason for that is largely because the public can't trust us, right? So we kind of get the public that we deserve. When we have scandal after scandal about people fiddling this and fiddling that, or taking a drive through the north of England to test their eyesight, people get the impression that the rules don't apply to everybody, and if they don't apply to everybody, they shouldn't apply to them. And those are individual examples. But we also see how people's trust in the system is eroded by mass non-participation, right? So you said that we don't require everybody to pay their taxes because a small number of people not paying their taxes doesn't make a big difference. But it does if they're doing it in a very prominent way, right? So the thing I try and teach all of my civil servant students who I teach is that government functions essentially by magic, right? It works because you believe it works. If you stop believing it works, like Tinkerbell in Peter Pan, it dies. And the most obvious example of that in the UK context is the poll tax, right? 30,000 people stop paying their poll tax. Everybody else is like, oh, those 30,000 people do not seem to be in prison, and the government is not going to put them in prison, and so why bother? Why should anybody bother paying? And we avoid it by very rapidly changing course. But as soon as the spell is broken on a particular tax, it is almost impossible to solve that problem. And so there is a real reason to worry about that non-compliance, even for like relatively modest, like what would appear in a lab experiment to be like a blip, right? 2 participants. Scale that up to 35 million taxpayers, that's probably 70,000 people, and that's a catastrophe in terms of public non-compliance.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I had lots of thoughts when you were speaking, and actually one of the thoughts I had was the reflection on society and sort of how much this varies across cultural contexts. I remember watching on TikTok, I watch TikTok, I'd probably guess you guys do too. There's this famous Korean experiment where there's a Korean influencer, yeah, but it's important for this context because he leaves the laptop at a railway station in different countries and then waits to see how long it takes to be stolen. And actually he did this in India, I'm originally from India, and then it was nipped very quickly. So when you said, can the public be trusted and in what context? I think there's also a large cultural heterogeneity that comes up here, which I know, Yuval, you sort of pointed to at some point. So maybe we can get some clarification there. But at this point, I'd like to sort of open up the floor for questions from the audience, because I can go on all evening, but let's hear from you. So, okay, I already see a hand back there, and
how much
here.
does education come into this?
And
I don't
here,
think
yes.
education student, does the person have a degree? I mean, when it comes to voluntary compliance, how does it matter if someone understands the subject at hand? For instance, recycling. Understanding the impacts on climate change doesn't make someone more likely to comply. How does that matter with, for instance, taxes?
Sorry, just some quick rules before we get into questions. So if you could introduce yourself briefly before you speak, and I collect 3 questions at once, and then we move on, and then it's open to the panel. So we'll start with Yuval, and then Liz and Michael, anybody who wants to jump in. So, yeah.
Yeah, Richard Fergus.
Thank you. And then we have a question here up front. So can we take that, please?
I can just shout, can't I?
Go for it.
Oh, reach the mic.
The people on YouTube won't be able to hear you though.
So, if this is about trusting people's decision making, surely the prior question, sorry, I should say, Beanland, Heat Pump Federation, in an ice bicyclist moment, I also have a book coming out. Actually, I don't, but I've got to say that. If we're worried about people's ability to make good decisions, surely we should be worried about where they get their information from in order to make good decisions. So the question that we're constantly wrestling with is, where do people get their information from for, in our particular field, of course, this is about decarbonisation, because where they get their information from is critical to the decision they make. And at the moment, we seem to be in a phase of history where there are some people who care not whether what they say is true. They just keep saying it, and they keep saying it very loudly, and unfortunately, a lot of people then believe it. And if you're up against people who don't care what they say is true, it's very, very difficult to cut through.
Thank you. And then the...
Hi, Almudena Lara. I work at Ofcom, leading work on online safety, and previously worked with Michael in Cabinet Office as well. And I actually noticed that you looked funny when TikTok was mentioned, but also building on the question before about where people are getting information from, and also particularly different generations and where they are getting their information from. Also noticing that there are very good behavioural scientists working for some of the social media companies. Just wanted to hear your reflections on the impact of social media on trust.
Thank you. Yuval, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So I have a lot of things to refer. Just two of the things that Liz mentioned. So I think it's interesting, the kind of pension versus compliance, to think about it as to what extent things we know from trying to get people to save more for their pension, could that be extended to things which usually most people not call it compliance, and then when we move it to things which kind of are sort of, in the interest of the public or the state rather than the individual interest, maybe many of those assumptions are less likely to work. So again, it could be interesting, and I think we talked about it, kind of come up with frameworks which will help us know if something worked in one domain, what's the likelihood that it's going to work in some other, given, for example, that in many contexts of compliance, you get nothing to earn from complying other than the fact that you benefit the public, the state, and so on. The second point you mentioned about corporations, so it's twofold. One, a lot of the kind of in the normative discussions we have, we think, for example, that past behavior of corporation is easier. This is what I noticed, again, not empirically testing it. People have easier time kind of swallowing the idea that we're going to treat corporations differently than people differently. Somehow the equality is stronger, the notion that you can treat people differently based on the past behavior. For corporations, first you have more data points, then it's kind of less seen as some violation of privacy. On the other hand, I will say, and you have another, it's a mostly normative, somewhat critical, that I think usually or mostly we can expect more unethical behavior coming from corporations relative to people. So usually if you put the same person under a corporation kind of role, they will behave less ethically. So somehow there's this feeling that once you are in the corporations, you're more competitive, you can kind of more likely to cut corners. So this particular paper is a law review, not a social science paper, but I think there is some, Benjamin Van Roy has some work on how corporations are taking the worst of people in a sense. And also just the point that Michael made before, but again, I think it's an interesting So would you say that even 1 or 2% could kind of I think there are some kind of, equilibrium and the idea that, I'm not sure if 1-2% could really shift the norm, but I think definitely there are a lot of behavioral mechanisms which will cause people to overestimate bad doing in society. So even if 1 or 2% and we learn about them and we see them not getting penalized, we will exaggerate because we have an interest to exaggerate and think, oh, we are great, those people are not paying on public transport. I mean, all those things are, a lot of the time, are exaggerated. And you see the gap between the real data on violation and what people assume. And I think there is this effort by governments to try to maybe correct this information or misinformation people have about how prevalent is non-compliance in society across different contexts. And about the 3 points from the public about education, I have to admit I don't know. I know there is some research on more education, less trust in general, and it makes sense. You have more kind of, you can trust your own judgment, and therefore you're not likely to always believe what you're being told. But I don't know about, yeah, I can speculate, but I don't know a study on that specifically. I think the other 2 points are somewhat related. So the information and social media and polarization. I think, that, again, a lot of the research about how polarization undermines trust-based regulation, I think is related to how we get our information, which is related to social media and the whole kind of fact that you, in social media, are more likely to hear people who think like yourself and get more negative views of others. And the combination is obviously likely to decrease the likelihood of trust working. And I think there's a lot of studies and I think a lot of tech attempts to try and reverse that in social media and try to, and I don't know if that's successful, but I know a lot of people are trying to do it.
Thank you. Liz or Michael, do you want to respond to any of those?
Sure. Happy to. I think maybe I'll first take the question at the back on what's the impact of education. And I think the answer is it really depends. I mean, education is, can look like a lot of different interventions. I think the main point I'd make is that there is often a very big gap between knowledge and awareness and behaviour change. And so the idea that if your theory of change is that you educate people and build knowledge and that necessarily leads directly to behaviour change, I think that's not the case in most contexts, but it really depends. So, one of the very first experiments I worked on at BIT was looking at sustainability and looking at ways, again, it's adjacent to compliance, but not directly compliance, but it was looking at ways to encourage people to take sustainable modes of transport to a workplace, to a large airport. And we looked at whether people knew that there were car sharing options available, and lots of people said that, now that they were aware of these car sharing options, they would definitely take them. And when we ran the trial, the number of people who actually took up those car sharing options was in the single digits, when actually a really large proportion of people had said that now that they knew about it, they wanted to do that. But I think there's other contexts where building skills and education has a really big impact. So particularly thinking about the work on inoculation and pre-bunking against disinformation. And there I think, you've got a much stronger case that actually specific types of education really do shift people's behaviour. I think on the point of the impact of social media on trust, I agree with Yuval that I think the main thing there is that it really has the potential to skew people's perception of the prevalence of compliance and non-compliance in lots of different contexts, and that is, that's a really dangerous thing, and it's hard to push back against that. So,
Michael?
I guess I don't have a great deal to add. So Gary Becker talks about rational crimes, right? So a crime which you should do. So the two types of people least likely to pay for parking are diplomats and economists, because an economist will say, well, it's £5 to park and it's a £100 fine. Do I think there is a lower than 5% chance of me getting caught? If yes, it is rational for me to not pay for my parking. So that's a dangerous consequence of what we would describe as being too much education, right? I am clever enough to know that I shouldn't pay for parking, but not clever enough to know that I should pay for parking because it's socially just, right? That's the classic economics, the price of everything and the value of nothing. But there are lots of rational crimes that only exist, but that are completely rational, right? So any crime that 80,000 people in this country are doing is a rational crime, by definition, because we have 81,000 places in prison, and if 80,000 people are doing it, the government cannot put them all in prison, and so it will be forced, in the event that 80,000 people, or 160,000 people, or 1 million people were not to do it, we're not going to do it. We're not going to put you in prison. And what are they going to do? Think about the poll tax. We're going to pay a poll tax. What are we going to do? Send me to prison? Probably not. Fine me? Well, I've already demonstrated that I'm willing to not pay something the government says I should pay. So at that point, actually, so people, in many ways, absent the social media argument, they massively underestimate the prevalence of crime, and they massively overestimate both the government's ability to detect crime and the government's willingness to do anything about it. And that is, we have relied as a state on that since the dawn of statehood, right? And even though our observation capacity is way greater than it's ever been, we have way more people who could commit way more crimes. So we are dependent on that magic of people actually, for most things, dramatically underestimating what non-compliance is, right? Because as it turns out, actually, whilst you should pay stamp duty on your second home if you buy a second home, very important, please remember this, like, unless you're the actual deputy prime minister and there are multiple newspapers whose sole occupation is trying to ruin your life, you are deeply unlikely to get caught. But most people obey the rules because some combination of they're nice and they don't realize that they can probably get away with it. And now I've just told everyone, but thankfully no one listens to what I have to say. The social media piece has the opportunity to completely skew that, right? There are a whole bunch of dimensions where it's just below the line, no one cares, right? No one, I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, most of TikTok is not about stamp duty?
That's correct.
That's correct, right, great. But there are some things that TikTok is very much about, and TikTok massively overestimates the prevalence of certain things, or forces you to massively, but it is, in that sense, completely amoral, right? They're not, people who own TikTok, well, that's possibly a bad example, the people who own Facebook are not trying to convince you that you shouldn't buy a heat pump, or they're not trying to convince you of all these other things. They're not. I don't think Nick Clegg cares if you buy a heat pump. I think the point is what they care about is pushing you in a direction which is addictive and which ups their revenue, which is completely amoral, right? They don't have to be bad actors for bad stuff to happen as a consequence of their behavior. So there are two things that need to happen, right, in my view. The first is people on the other side of the argument need to care more about winning and less about being right, which is to say, the people who we disapprove of, people who hate heat pumps, and you can think of whatever group it is that you have in your head as I'm talking, and we won't ask you to volunteer, like, they don't care about being right, they only care about winning, and so we need to work out how we weaponize these platforms in exactly the same way as the people who we are opposed to have done. Right? That is a job for the public, for charities, etc. What government needs to do is perhaps think a little bit less about, behavioural public policy and just think about old-fashioned public policy, right? Guns are really dangerous because they cause deaths. Turns out ChatGPT might also be really dangerous because it causes deaths in the wrong hands. We have traditional non-nudge-based tools for doing that. We just ban shit. And whilst we're probably not going to ban ChatGPT, like, we should at least be thinking that that is in our toolbox, right? We shouldn't be reaching first of all for the nudge-based toolbox. We should be thinking about how do we regulate other things that are harmful. End of song.
Yeah. No, I think the last point I agree with, and that was one of the early skepticisms of nudges as well with the Regulatory Oversight Committee, that, it might just push out these other tools from the toolkit with too much dominance of nudge-based policies.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of that argument as well.
Well, we can have that side chat later. Let me open it up for another round. I'm going to focus a bit on this side because it's a bit quiet. Do we have...
Not hearing enough from the left at a
No,
university event.
okay, we can definitely pick up a question on the right then.
This is what we're saying, right? It's the people on the right want to have their voices heard.
We do.
Hi, Angus Berry. I'm at the Regulation Directorate in Department of Business and Trade. Yuval, my answer to your question is we have to trust the public, but for the reason Michael said, is we don't have a state capacity to go after everyone. And it does feel we're at the point you described, Michael, in which we're kind of at the limits of that and having to reach for more punishment and sanction over other methods. And it feels like that leads to three dynamics. First of all, you get the kind of the Barnard Castle description you give, the same one where people push through tube barriers, everyone sees that and feels like a chump. I don't know if that's the word in the literature, but that's the emotion. That not only makes you rationally feel like you can get away with it, but erodes your own sense of moral code and shifts that equilibrium. The second is that if you are at that point of state capacity, it's easier to go after the person who, when they get a fine through the letterbox, will pay it. And that only reinforces that sense of being a chump. And then the last, which I think is probably the most pernicious, you get kind of literal compliance, where people do comply, but they do in intensely literal ways. So lots of construction firms will do this in how they comply with regulations. People claiming out-of-work benefits will use the WhatsApp script rather than be genuinely honest about their circumstance. So you get those kind of dynamics. So are we at that point? And if we are, how do we reverse course?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Hayat. I'm a student to be here in Global Affairs. Apologies for the very simplistic questions. But yeah, my take on everything is what I find quite confusing in life is that a company can declare bankruptcy and a person can't. And usually that it's just inherently unfair for someone to, if someone's in debt, someone will come collect their stuff, and if a company is, they can declare bankruptcy. Although a couple of friends of mine have declared bankruptcy, and you're basically cast out from society for like 5 years. But yeah, my question is, it's a question where there's an answer, but on my way, actually yesterday, I stumbled upon the term effective altruism, and I actually didn't want to look it up because I thought, it's going to come, it'll circle back. And I just, what does it mean? And is it only applicable for foreign aid, or is it something that people can do? Sorry, this might be super simplistic, but yeah.
We take it, and the man in the jacket there, yeah.
I might be sitting on the right from your perspective, but from here it's on the left, so I just want to say that. Gavin Barlow, postgrad at King's. I just wanted to ask, if Nigel Farage was Prime Minister, do you think he would want to listen to behavioural scientists? And if he did, how afraid should we be?
That one definitely is for Michael. Right. Yuval, do you want to kick us off?
Well, some things here are more for UK people to answer. I don't know enough about the politics, but so the first and the second one. The first was Angus was asking. I think obviously government on one hand want to trust the public. At the end of the day, you don't see regulators are excited to trust the public. I think some of them are very risk averse, very afraid to find that they trusted too much. They don't pay the price for trusting too little, more on trusting too much. Some of the things I discuss in the book is, in a sense, is there a way for governments to monitor without the devastating cost of monitoring? So, generally, the theory is that once people feel they are being monitored, kind of a checklist approach, then everything they do is very shallow and it's problematic. And the question is whether you could somehow give the people the feeling that they are being trusted, at the same time, kind of on the margins, making sure they are not crossing the line. And some of the discussion I have is with the advancement of technology and AI, in a sense, it gives governments the ability to monitor without having a police officer watch every move, which obviously going to undermine the likelihood of any form of quality. So there is some trust but verify, all those kind of approaches which try to combine between the good thing associated with trust without losing too much if we trust. And so this is, I think, something that with the advancement of algorithmic enforcement we will see more and more. The individual versus corporation that, yes, I think in a way to the best of my understanding, the idea of cooperation is to push them to take more risk. So this is why it's, and it's related to a lot of good things that happen in society. I mean, we can view it as a very bad thing from various perspectives, but I think why I think it's actually in this country the companies were invented was for people to take greater economic activities which individuals would be afraid, and we view innovation and entrepreneurship as things which benefit society, even though on distributive justice it creates a lot of problems. But I think, and I don't know, the third question, I think
So,
Go on, jump in.
so a slight rejoinder on that. The creation of the corporation was a mechanism for allowing people to de-risk investments in the wholesale shipping of human beings from one side of the world to the other. Yeah, so the Dutch invented the corporation as a mechanism for de-risking the slave trade, which I'm all in favor of entrepreneurialism. That I would say probably would be beyond.
wasn't the East India Company?
No, that was when we invented renationalizing entire corporations because they were running entire countries. But that was probably we should have historians rather than behavioural policy people for this.
Maybe next time I have someone from the Strand group
yeah.
on that one. Liz, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I was going to reflect on your 3 points about the being a chump and then also getting people to comply in intensely literal ways. And Yuval and I were having a conversation earlier about beyond compliance and how you can encourage people to not just comply but go beyond it. And I was actually thinking when you were making your remarks, there's probably some areas, particularly at an individual level, where the state is quite happy for people to comply in intensely literal ways. So speeding, tax, vaccination, yep, intensely literal tick, that's good. But then there's lots of other areas where actually you do want innovation and flexibility. And I think, there's some at the individual level. I think there's a lot more actually at corporate regulation at the corporate level. So particularly things like environmental standards, workplaces, some of the new regulation in the UK around things like mandatory health targets for grocery retailers. You really don't want them to be complying with that in intensely literal ways. And some of the work we've been doing at BAT, which is a bit adjacent to this, is looking at how do you create greater transparency around the extent to which companies are doing a good job on different metrics. So if we take the grocery example, it's not just are they complying with the health targets, but actually which grocery stores are doing that really well. Is Waitrose creating a much healthier basket and a cheaper basket for their customers compared to Lidl? And also, how do you reflect that back to consumers so that they're able to pick a grocery store that is on their side, that is trying to create a healthier basket for them? And I know this is a little away from the individual compliance, but I think it's a really important dynamic of then also it creates these reinforcing trust signals for individuals of not just, can they be trusted, but who can they trust as well.
Would you like to reflect on Nigel Farage?
Oh, yeah, thanks for that, Sunshine. So I should begin my remarks by saying I used to be a civil servant, and therefore the part of my brain that would allow me to feel or express political opinions has been surgically removed. Anything in the following that sounds like it's a political opinion, you are mistaken. So let's not talk about Nigel Farage. Let's talk about some hypothetical future government that wishes to do some manner of thing which you might disagree with, and which deviates from democratic norms in some major way, right? And this is a thing we might have here. It's a thing you might have in any number of other countries around the world. And the question is, are we worried they're going to use nudges for evil? And my answer to that is probably not. And the reason for that is because if you're minded to do evil, you have a whole bunch of other tools available to you, and your evil is actually surprisingly easy to do if you're armed with the full might and majesty of the state. So at the beginning of the behavioral insights team, there were people on the right saying this was going to be nanny state-ish, psychologically controlling your mind and manipulating you in particular ways. And they're fine, they can write that if they want to, but the idea is that, like me writing to you and saying that 9 out of 10 people in your area have paid their taxes on time is in some way going to, that's an oppressive use of state force, is kind of ridiculous on the basis that the state has a whole bunch of other powers. So, for example, if I wanted to go back to your argument, if I wanted to reduce the public's belief in climate change, I wanted to advance a radical anti-net zero agenda, I could tell you that most people don't believe in climate change. Or I could get rid of the BBC. And that's a much more terrifying idea than the idea that they might find some behavioral scientists in the basement, and that's where I would be directing my worry. But your mileage may differ. On the effective altruism question, because I'm conscious we haven't yet answered that, there is an idea within a group of people who care deeply about making the world a better place that we should be putting our money where it is most effective. So this is an argument which advocates for example, the use of bed nets to stop mosquitoes which prevent malaria. And this is a very sensible, evidence-based solution. It moves you away from a vibes-based approach to charitable giving, which sees people giving lots of money to, for example, donkey sanctuaries. Now, the problem with it as a way of thinking is twofold. One, people really care about donkeys, and if you tell them you shouldn't care about donkeys, you should care about thing X, you don't make them care about thing X, you might make them care slightly less about giving money to the donkeys. And you've just made them feel bad, which isn't ideal. The second is there's a kind of, it goes to an extreme because you are, on average, if you're in the particularly metastasized version of this movement, you are a generally hyper-educated white guy. Not exclusively, there are hyper-educated white women in there as well. But you think, actually, saving lives now isn't actually very important because the future is infinite. And so what I should be worried about is existential risks to society, and so actually we should be focused on setting up centres that focus on not the reduction of poverty now or the prevention of harm now, but the prevention of Arnold Schwarzenegger kicking the door in with a shotgun or massive rocks from space killing us all, right? So they're dealing with infinitesimal possibilities of extreme risk. And then you say, actually, I'm not even sure we're right about that. In fact, what we should do is we should spend that money on creating an institute that allows me and my friends, see aforementioned demographics, think extensively and deeply about what those risks might be and where we should put our money. And so what we should do is we should buy a mansion outside of Oxford where me and my friends can go and think deeply. Because that's actually, that helping me and my friends think deeply is the way we're going to have the most benefit to society in the very, very long term. Now, that sounds like I'm being silly, but this is true and you can Google it. So it has its core, it is a part of evidence-based policy, right? So we should be trying to promote good causes where we actually have an impact. But there is an extreme metastasized version of it that is really quite dangerous, in my view. But again, as I say, any views you hear me express, purely coincidental.
Okay, we are in good time for one last round of questions. We'll start with...
And I will not give any answers to the next round of questions because I'm conscious I've been taking up too much time.
No, not at all. The lady here in the black dress.
Thank you so much for the debate so far. I'm Flora. I'm a consultant at Embed and President Director of Brazilian Institute of Behavioral Sciences. I was recently reading the work from Alina Rostrom and how in situations of maybe cooperation and that requires compliance to, in such like that, how it resonates. So as an alternative to privatization or to government enforcement, you can trust the people and you should trust the people, or rather you should trust the features of a system and some design principles that allow trust and reciprocity to occur. And as a behavioral scientist, I haven't found I'm not aware of many interventions that connect these two fields, but it seems to me that in this particular setting, it could be quite, I don't know, interesting interconnection. So I'd like to know if it resonates to you, if you know any examples, and maybe on shifting this perspective from individual interventions to how do you shape a system with regulations so that people can cooperate based on behavioral science insights in that sense. Thanks.
I don't know of any interventions. I know of Adam's trilogy that talks about the art of reciprocity, so I would definitely recommend that. We have a question here. And sorry.
Adam has a surname?
Oh, sorry, yeah, Adam Oliver. For those who will visit the conference, you will definitely meet him. Sorry, sir, go for it.
It's okay, thanks very much. Matthew Bell from Frontier Economics. I'm wrestling with this idea that, on the one hand, it seems to take a relatively few number of people disobeying the rules to bring all of society down, whether it's ignoring the poll tax or skipping, not paying for the tube, or doing something else, and the chumps win, as against the fact that society does continue to function despite the fact that people do all of these things. And so I'm wondering what your view then is about whether we're at a unique point in the last 500 years and everything's about to disintegrate because we don't trust each other, or whether there are bigger or different enforcing mechanisms that mean people in the end do trust strangers.
Thank you. Time for one last question. If there is any, no pressure. Yeah, please.
Hi, Russell Pirry from Omnicom Media Group. I found it very interesting you talking about trust as being a two-way relationship. It's not just that we get the government we deserve, but the government gets the public that it deserves as well. But my question boils down to a lot of Yuval's research, or asking about the research, in that if you see higher levels, so you mentioned the OECD ranking list of trust. Do you see correlations between higher rates, higher levels of trust in government and higher levels of compliance and reciprocity there? Whether that be proxy metrics, or whether that be actual compliance, such as in payment of tax. You know, we know, for example, that from HMRC there is about a 90% level of people paying their self-assessment tax returns on time and online. Does that differ when you see different levels of trust, say in the Nordic countries, for example?
Thank you.
So actually it's interesting, we have one paper in progress where we show that tax in authorities is not correlated with adherence to health policy regulations, so it's almost negative correlation. But in most other contexts, usually it's positive correlation. So higher trust countries, they are more associated with higher compliance rate, but it's not consistent. So I think we found that we did some kind of cross-culture on existing data, not our own, that, and I think in tax there was a positive correlation, negative in health, and I think it was insignificant when it comes to environmental compliance, which was somehow not associated with trust. So I guess it's a more nuanced answer than it's not across the board. That's my current answer. Just to about the Unstrom kind of studies. So I think there is studies on Wikipedia by Benkler, how Wikipedia works, and there is an Airbnb. There are all kind of case studies, books around Airbnb, Uber, where trust and actually algorithms can help us trust by relying on reputation and relying on the lack of interest but yeah, I don't know if it's really trust or it's more kind of but yeah, but there are some studies on that.
Yeah, a nice example, as you know, a lot of Eleanor Ostrom's work looked at the governance of common natural resources, and one of her innovations, I guess, was to devolve that governance to people closest to those resources and the impacts of their mismanagement or proper management. And I think one of the interesting things that's happening around the world is the groups that are coming up around smartphone-free childhoods, and parent groups that are self-organising around that and cooperating. So, for example, in Australia, the government has recently banned social media for under 16s. That ban is effectively unenforceable. But what has happened is that it's galvanized cooperation amongst parents to come together and have the license to say, actually, because of this government intervention, we feel empowered to say, yes, we are going to coordinate and cooperate with each other, agree that we won't allow our children to have social media up until a certain age, and then work with each other to enforce and kind of self-regulate that within, you know, this community, this school, this parent group. So I think that's a nice example of it.
Go for it. We do have time.
No, I have nothing to say, Sanchia.
Oh, that is, I must say, that never happens most of the time. This is a unique moment. We should capture it. In that case, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the excellent panel. Yeah, thanks for sharing all your thoughts. Yuval, many congratulations again on your book. It's coming out with Cambridge University Press. I'm on the website now, and it says it's expected in November. I was a bit disappointed I didn't get a copy of the book yet, but...
You will.
Well, thanks again. There are drinks on the other side of the room here. I'll sort of welcome you to stay and join us for networking and discussions. And thank you once again to all of you.